Welcome back, everyone. We will now begin with our next session, responding to the impact of COVID-19 on informal workers, building back better. I warmly welcome the moderator for this session, Mr. N. Srinivasan, expert, development, finance, and rural livelihoods, and our esteemed panel of guests, Dr. Ravi Srivastav, Professor and Director, Center for Employment Studies Institute, HD, Mr. Rajiv Khandelwal, Co-founder and Director, Ajivika Bureau, Dr. Sanjeev Falnaskar, Director, Vikas Anvesh Foundation, Dr. Gayatri Vasudevan, Co-founder and CEO, LaborNet, and Dr. Indradeep Ghosh, Executive Director, Dwara Research. I would like to thank everyone for joining in for this very important session. And with this, I now hand over the session to the moderator, Mr. Srinivasan.
Thank you, Priyambada. And I think for organizing this panel and also the entire track on informal sector today, I should thank Access and also Niti Aayog, who have, I think, joined hand with Hand in Hand India to look at the plight of the informal sector, whether it is the women's access to finance, which preceded us, or the issues relating to workers, especially as a result of the pandemic that we are experiencing. Actually, here I am blessed with a number of people who have done important work in the sector, whether it is Dr. Srivastav or Dr. Ghosh or Dr. Pansalkar, and of course Dr. Gayatri is at the forefront of several things relating to this, and of course Rajiv, who may not remember having met me sometime in 2008 when he had started issuing these identity cards for migrant labor going over to Mumbai. It's a very interesting experiment which had lots of impact. So these are people who have actually done solid work on the ground. As I was telling in the inaugural remarks when I started this track, usually we suffer from a lack of data. We have to refer to some survey or something about 10 years back. But now more data is available, and more importantly, field-based surveys have taken place in the last about 10 months. The number, variety, and also depth of these surveys, including one which was released yesterday by Premji University, that has been excellent. It gives us information of a kind that we would probably not have, say, even 3-4 years back. Having said that, yeah, the issues relating to informal sector, they are reasonably well known. That there is a preponderance of very poor people at the bottom of the pyramid who occupy the informal sector space. And then there are issues in relation to assets, income, quality of livelihoods, access to basic services. These are all reasonably well known. When things seem to be improving slightly in the informal sector over the last, say, about 7-8 years, because of the rural areas getting access to things like the employment guarantee scheme, the PDS under the NFSA kicking in, trying to ensure at least food security of a kind which was not so easy, say about 10 years back. Also, some of the income support schemes and pension schemes that have been introduced for old age people, women, disabled, some strengthening of the nutrition schemes and integrated child development support scheme. These seem to improve the situation marginally, and with the people migrating from wherever they were to newer places in search of employment and livelihoods, certain things seem to improve. But then overall, like Vijay Mahajan, when he inaugurated the conference, when he was talking about his initial remarks based on his overview of the soil report, the growth at macro terms, it has been typically jobless. We should not say less job growth, not jobless growth. Jobs have increased somewhat with lesser and lesser employment intensity. That kind of a growth resulted in the informal sector being larger than it should have been. But also one of the things that we miss out in the discourse on the informal sector is that it is seen from the view of those who are employed. Even now when we look at, of the total employment, X% is in informal sector. But there is a large part which is not employed, which is in the informal sector again. We have to reckon what happens to them. Because the kind of data on employment that we all see, review, and then comment upon, most of us know it is limited. Because it talks about those who are willing to participate in the so-called labor force. What about those who are not willing to participate? If they are otherwise in an employable age where they should be earning their livelihood, why they do not want to come into the labor force is a question. There are several things that have been asked somewhere, and some of them have been answered. Especially women typically do not want to come into labor force if what you offer them is a pittance. I think ILO used to have a ratio called, it still has that ratio called NEAT, not in education, employment or training. If you are in an employable age band, and if the NEAT ratio is what calculates the real unemployment level, meaning you should be working or you should be being trained somewhere or you are in education. These are three reasons why you are not earning your livelihood, setting up something. But if these are all not there, then but we have an unemployment measurement which is linked to the participation rates, and then so the point I'm making is the informal sector is much larger than the data that we confine ourselves when we analyze. So when we look at what happened during the pandemic, this sector has been impacted. All of you probably know more because several of you have been part of field surveys, field studies, especially Indradeep being there with a significant amount of work done, I think, in several rounds by Dwara's research people. I think the amount of knowledge you have on how COVID impacted everyone, and more so the visuals that we saw in the media, they have been quite tough on many of us. People walking home, people being sprayed with disinfectants, stuff like that. They may be extremes. But what was moderate is also that considerable loss of jobs. Like the Premji University said, about 70% of the women were out of work who were employed before COVID struck. 70% of them, they were out of work. And even today, 22% women who lost the jobs then, they have not been able to get back in. This is what Premji University survey, which came out yesterday, says. So the impact of COVID, it has been on livelihoods, jobs. It has been on the kind of services that they were accustomed to get from public institution, private sector. It has been also on the welfare net that was available there. There have been incremental attempts that the government made, but still there were several shortfalls. I think maybe Indradeep will probably later on talk about some of these. The quality of life overall, I think the informal sector has had a very bad deal because of the pandemic. The burden of the pandemic is disproportionately on probably these people. Because when we talk about risk management, there is a theory that the risk will be pushed down to the level which cannot pass it further. The best equipped person manages to push the risk down one level and one level and one level and so on. The informal sector is our bottom level from where the risk cannot go further. So the COVID's impact on the bottommost part, that is the informal sector, had been most acute. I think of all this that we talked about, I would think the worst impact is on their confidence. Confidence in the sense, their confidence in receiving a fair deal from those who were earlier their employer, who were their service providers, who were their, donors, whether they are in urban area, they are philanthropists. The confidence in them has been shaken big time, which is reflected in the much lower number of people who are willing to come back to the places where they were originally. Before this reverse migration started, they are not willing to come back. So there are several fronts on this, but then we are looking at the session says building back better. So I would not like to take more time than this to give the overview. Basically, this is where we are. Now I will try and get back to you like we had earlier thought. We have some 4 or 5 questions which we will work around, and we will try and keep it conversational. My request to the audience is, if you have any questions, please keep feeding them in. I will try and put the questions through even as we keep going into successive rounds of discussion, so that your question might be probably more relevant than what we have thought of. We will try and accommodate that. And Priyambada, please ensure that I am able to get the screens on my chat screen as and when the questions are shared by the audience. So they might be just topical for whatever we are discussing over there. So what I would do is, now I will start with an introductory kind of question where about each of us can spend about 5 minutes talking about in what ways the impact that the informal sector workers took was unexpected? Was it unexpected for you, or would you have guessed that this is what might happen? And then, meaning right now, how do you feel about their problems? Are there things that could have been done, what do you call, slightly better, and what kind of impact they have had on that? What I think I would first maybe start with Dr. Gayatri Vasudevan, because I think she is the clearing house of where the public sector, private sector meet, the informal sector, those who want employment, and the corporate who wants to employ them. Also, the donors and the donees, all of them meet, I think, in LabourNet. So I think you have a go, Dr. Gayatri.
Thank you very much for, I think, setting the context of the problem. So when I was listening to your question and thinking about it, I think the first thing that is evident are two things. The informal sector workers who were in the city never owned the city, and the city didn't own. I think that was a clear one. Popular media, if you look at every movie, irrespective of the language, we see that. The loneliness of a person in an urban city we see, but I don't think we all absorbed the severity of it. The second thing is, every time the conversations have been around identity, the full impact of identity wasn't really understood. What does it mean for housing? What does it mean for food? What does it mean for just passage? That means, do you have right of passage from one place to the other? I think were issues that were hugely underestimated. So in my opinion, this is actually callousness. If you have the and the number that we have, there's no business not to know it. But strangely, all of us did not know it. And then I also felt that we were, in a sense, quite schizophrenic. At one level, as an employer, our labor practices are in a particular manner. At another level, as a civil society citizen, same citizen came out to help. So you often found the, in a sense, the dichotomy of people behaving differently, the same person possibly having two personas. Because as an employer, one is distant from the worker. The immediate employer of the informal sector worker is often little more than the worker, who are also hugely terrified and didn't know how to really deal with a crisis. Which means if we have such a large quote-unquote contractual managerial class there, we need to also be able to sensitize them, include them in our laws. It's not just punitive, but it is a whole system which requires that awareness. So often we are thinking of it only as do we have the codes, do we have the laws to protect? We may have that, but if the customary application of it is poor, I think there is an issue. So just to sum up, a lonely, homeless population, which is possibly about 30 to 40% of every city's population, every industrial estate's population, probably to the tune of 50 to 70%, was a population which we knew was faceless, but I think it played out more severely. It was amplified.
Rajiv, I now turn to you. Dr. Gayatri had poignantly explained the lonely, homeless people, but a large number within a city. You handle them, and you handle some of the aftermaths as well. So how do you look at this?
Thank you, Srinivasan, and for the opportunity to come on this platform, especially with a group from whom we have learned so much. We draw very heavily upon Professor Srivastav's and Professor Phansalkar's writings and reflections on the state of the economy and labor livelihoods. And Gayatri's own work, LabourNet's early work in Bangalore, became the very building block of our own practice in Ajivika. To your question specifically, whether it was unexpected, I would say, looking back, It was not unexpected. You know, what happened immediately after lockdown and in the months that followed was in many ways an amplification of what we already knew. And I think informal workers, migrant workers especially, were failed on two very major fronts. And I will only reframe what Gayatri just said. The first front that they were failed was the labor, their own employment relations front. You know, informality brings a certain dynamic to their stability, to their, you know, to how they will be treated in case of a sudden shock. And we had large scale failure of wage payments. We had massive kind of, you know, retrenchments against kind of government advice. We saw several people turned out in middle of their work contracts with no guarantee of getting the money back. Of course, there was no social security and no entitlements that they could avail of at the point of their employment. So the work front itself failed informal workers at, you know, at a very large scale. The other front that failed them was the city, the urban front, you know, the habitat front. Large numbers of people living inside work sites, inside factories and construction sites, who were almost the first ones to be turned out on the streets and highways, who started to walk back. People without domicile documents, unable to access ration or even relief provisions that were being offered, because as migrants they did not qualify, you know, for state assistance in the cities, or, you know, lack of access to healthcare. Then all of this kind of got snowballed into transportation kind of blues and so on. It's all behind us now. But I think on those two fronts, what we knew was an existing endemic issue became amplified and you know, became kind of clear to very large numbers. And I think work remains undone to be on both the fronts, on the front of informality and employment relations, and in urban inclusion and governance. You know, this is where we need to work mostly. Personally, you know, what probably took me aback at that time, and I'm only going back to those days, I'm sure there were other more shocking kind of experiences, was the treatment to people in passage and what happened upon their arrival in rural areas. You know, we work on both rural and urban end, and I actually probably did not expect the kind of stigmatization that migrants were facing when they returned home at the very gate of their own communities. That I think took me aback. But what did not take me aback was, you know, the state of India's labor during a pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you, Raju. I think if you said this was somewhat unexpected, it must have been really something. Because I thought in your 15 years on the ground there, you've seen quite a number of things out. But I'll now turn to Dr. Srivastav. In all this, is there a sense that we have underestimated the size of the problem and continue to underestimate the problem? So in addition to how you feel about what has happened, if you could also address this.
Yeah. So I think Srinivasan, you talked about what is unexpected and asked me about the size and scale of the problem and whether we continue to underestimate it. I think the question of unexpected has to be answered, it has to be reframed in terms of unexpected for whom and in what sense. To someone like me or somebody like Rajiv and maybe even Gayatri and others, what happened was not unexpected. You know, earlier that year, I had actually presented a paper in the Labor Economics Conference, which was called Informality, Migration, and Discrimination, you know, which looked at these three linked aspects and pointed out the close connection between all of this. So in the sense that what we saw in the face of this crisis was a very large overlap between informality and circular migration. The fact that informality and informal workers, you know, formed something like a huge proportion of the urban workforce, and out of them, circular migrants alone probably from 50 to 70% of the workforce, and that our social protection network was extremely patchy in any case, and particularly when it came to the urban workforce. was the fact that we were sitting on such a volcano of precarity, and that most of us were not aware of it, and that it needed a sudden lockdown and a complete lockdown to show us the nature of this precarity, is something which was certainly unexpected for most of us. And the other dimension was, which was still unexpected, even when this volcano burst, was the public policy response to it, which in the initial weeks and months, and if you look at the affidavits in the Supreme Court up to the 3rd week of June, showed the degree of callousness of the public policy response and the lack of understanding that they had toward these set of problems. Over a period of time, this tended to get corrected, but initially you could see what it meant. So I think these were things which were very unexpected in many senses, but these were issues which many of us have grappled over decades and have been pointing out to the public policy, to public policy domains, that this needs to be dealt with. We need to have a set of policies in place to deal with them. And I think now that we had this volcano burst, this is the time to understand it, to understand the scale of it, and to understand how we can deal with it. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Srivastava. That bit scary, meaning the way you put it, we were on the edge of tipping into the volcano which was about to burst, and we were, quite a number of us were totally unaware. Though these were there, and also the extent to which the enormity of the problem was not recognized for quite some time. I now turn to Dr. Sanjeev Pansalkar. Thank you for that excellent chapter you and Rajiv have co-authored, which brings out several dimensions. So I would also request you to spend maybe a minute or so in what you are going to say on. Do you see there is a differential between what happened to the urban versus what happened to the rural informal people in all this?
Okay. Thank you for being invited for this very interesting panel discussion. I would begin by saying that, Dr. Srivastava has been talking about how nobody had an inkling about the enormity of the problem. I think the public policy failed grossly because I think all of us academics failed, in a sense, in the decades prior to this. Almost a decade back, we had this release of the report done by Ajivika and IJIDR about this issue. And there was a big discussion, and I was that time in a donor position, so we were supporting that. And so this issue, how many circular migrants are there in the country? Ajivika gave a number of 120 million, and that was said to be terribly, terribly exaggerated or something by people who had access to data. And the tragedy is that nobody had any data. The census did not have a definition for a circular migrant. Now, if census is the basic source of all data on which the edifice of the public policy is built, and that does not provide for a category or circular migrants, then obviously the enormity of ignorance can only be realized only when a shock comes. So this is the first point I would like to make. The second point I would like to make, I would fully support the poignancy with which Dr. Gayatri and Rajiv have been talking about. Typically as an urban dweller, one expects your informal worker, domestic help or whatever to come at the time appointed, provide the services given, and then kind of wither away in space. We really don't give two hoots where she lives, what does her children do, and so on and so forth. So this huge amount of apathy, which is traditionally built in our mind, and let's not put the entire blame on public policy. We have failed. The urban elites like you and me, we have failed in looking after our people. The employers have failed. That was very unexpected for me. I thought we would have greater, particularly after all that Thali Bajao and all that kind of show of unity. I thought people would have looked after each other, but they did not. And the third thing that was very unexpected for me was the docility with which these informal workers kind of accepted as if that was their immutable destiny, and they suffered all the pangs and then they went. One did not get the sense of anger, angst, violence from them. They just suffered and went. So now, so far as urban and rural is concerned, I think the rural informal sector workers have been much better looked after than the urban ones, partly because the points about not being wanted or loneliness, those were not so severely faced by them. And they were in a kind of setting which was familiar to them. And that there is perhaps a much greater sharing culture among the rural people. They share their poverty and hunger much more than probably we do. So that would be the singular difference between the urban and the rural informal work. But that's my guess. I mean, I don't have a database to say. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Thank you, Dr. Pansalkar. Now I turn to Dr. Indradeep Ghosh. I think again, thank you for that exceedingly insightful article on the informality and the extent of unmitigated risk that exists in the sector. Here, one of the things that we heard from the others also is that lots of welfare and safety net programs were designed as a response at some stage or the other. Would you also care to look a little bit at how good these were? Were we able to actually deliver what was promised?
Yeah, no, thank you first for inviting me to be part of this panel of very, very distinguished, experienced people. I am actually a newcomer to this space, having joined Dwara about 14 months ago. And, good timing, because as soon as I joined, about 4 months in, the pandemic hit us. Now, in terms of preparedness, we at Dwara, we started something called a social protection initiative in early 2019. And that initiative started looking at some of the social protection systems in India and from the perspective of last mile delivery. And in fact, we were, when the pandemic hit, so we already had a fledgling framework to understand to assess the performance of these welfare schemes. And in many ways, the pandemic offered us a real-time audit of that of the framework that we had created. And so, in some sense, we knew that there were some gaps, there were some potential problems with last mile delivery of social welfare schemes. What the pandemic did was only give us information and give us confirmation about some of the hypotheses that we already had, and also opened our eyes to a few things that we were not expecting. So, for example, our working hypothesis going into COVID-19 was that, of course, we didn't know COVID-19 was coming, but our working hypothesis prior to COVID-19 was that if there are welfare programs that are backed by statute, for example, food safety, Manrega, etc., that they would work better than welfare schemes which are not backed by statute. And what we discovered, and what we are continuing to discover, I also think that the work of understanding how these welfare schemes have performed in the wake of COVID-19 is not over yet. We are still learning about all of the difficulties that beneficiaries are facing of various different schemes, not just the schemes that were introduced after the pandemic hit, but schemes that were already in place before the pandemic hit. And we found that even schemes like Manrega and PDS have not performed as expected. And so we have been actually studying, DBT, we have been studying Manrega, we have been studying PDF, and identifying all of the different problems that beneficiaries have faced across the board. And this worries us because while there is a move to, there is a growing recognition that India needs to move to a quote unquote rights-based social security system, it is not clear to us that even a rights-based social security system will ipso facto by that very fact deliver what we expect it to deliver. unless government functionaries at the local level do what they are supposed to be doing, which is what we discover, in many ways is the crux of the problem. For example, in PDS, we find that people, many people reported being charged for ration entitlements that were announced as ex gratia under the PMGKY. And fair price shops engaged in what is called discretionary denial. I've heard of discretionary approval, but COVID-19, has thrown up this phenomenon where fair price shops, this was very commonly experienced by some of the beneficiaries. We talked to many beneficiaries, hundreds of beneficiaries, and we talked to them. So we had them call in and discuss what they were experiencing, and this is what we found. So I think for us, this was the, we already knew that some of the schemes, the DBT schemes, for instance, there were all sorts of problems. There are 4 different layers of possible exclusion that can happen with the DBT scheme. So there can be exclusion at the beneficiary identification stage, at the enrollment stage, at the back-end processing stage, and finally at the cash out stage. We already knew that, but what I think what was surprising to us was how some of these statute-based or statute-backed welfare programs performed during COVID, or underperformed, I should say.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. I think the point you make is even prior to COVID, we had this NREGS, which is a rights-based scheme, which is statutorily backed. Rural household that demand work, they should get 100 days in a year. If they don't get, the government has either to pay a compensation or government can be taken to court. But if you look at the data, the kind of compensation that is asked for and provided is so small. And we have never crossed, I think, 45 days a year on an average in any of the last maybe 12, 13 years. So what you say is true. This was before the COVID increased the demand for these jobs. Then after it, there are issues that come out there. I think now I will move into a set of questions. Yeah, we have this problem. We have seen this, the loneliness, the enormity of the problem, the failure to actually, even at an individual level, like Dr. Pansalkar says, for people to recognize the nature of what we do and then say somebody else did not do their job. Were there any positive thing that we saw? I'm not talking about very individualized, what do you call, excellence that was exhibited, like somebody gave food for 10, 20 days for 20 people, not that. Did you see some, even a smaller scale kind of a positive thing that had happened across that we think has the potential to be taken further? Rajiv, can I start with you first? You're on mute, Rajiv. Yeah.
Apologies. No, that's a really good question, because we often tend to focus on, everything that went wrong. And I think 2 things would stand out for me. Firstly, of course, it has to do with citizen action. I think during the whole lockdown period and the unfolding of the restrictions, I think the kind of citizen action we saw was quite remarkable. We for example, we run a labor helpline. It's a phone-based service. Within a week of the lockdown, there were at least 20 other helplines that were being well managed, were networking with each other. There was strong kind of a alternative response network had already come into place, not looking just at providing food or transportation, but also helping people with their wages, with their retrenchment, in the way they were being treated at the workplace and so on. So to me, that, I kind of hold on to that reminder that a lot of citizens and citizen groups and civil society groups, trade unions sprung into action. And we should capture that sense of initiative that we saw at that time. The second thing, which is it's probably too small to be flagged as a general positive development, but I've certainly been part of some conversations in large industrial spaces, in large corporate spaces, who are talking about cleaning up their supply chains. Okay, not just in terms of environment, or pollution, but actually labor practice. And I think there is a general environment in which at least some industrialists are thinking about the core labor standard issues, not just in terms of philanthropists, but also in terms of what does it mean for their own business to not have something like this happen again, which means looking at how contractual labor or labor force in their suppliers and vendors or in their front end, what is happening to their wages, their minimum wages, their housing and so on. That conversation is small, limited, but it has begun to happen. For me, it is a very satisfying kind of a small start that I see.
I am on mute. Yeah, Dr. Gayatri, I now turn to you. Did you also see, as part of this positive, what do you call, vibes that you might have come across, was there a greater amount of corporate involvement?
Yes, there was a lot of immediate corporate involvement. I mean, most of them gave very generously and largely, but I would say, I'd echo what Rajiv said. The citizens coming forward, both as individuals and the other thing I would say is that the need for civil society organization was actually felt. Without that organizational capability, I don't think the delivery could have happened at the last mile. The other thing is, like Rajiv again said, there are very small but relevant conversations which have started. I quote a very small initiative, but there's a very large conglomerate which is really looking at housing, saying that, where will people in construction sites stay? And can these, is there a return on investment? That means what kind of material is used, what land is used, and then if they're housed here, if they give them better living conditions, can that actually be over a period of 10 years, is there a return of investment, and therefore should they do it? Of course, the pilot is going to be for 100, but the point is that it is between a funder and a builder. So I think that's the interesting part. So those kinds of things needs to be proven. We need to show the economic things. People have started at least talking about it. Similarly, I think in industrial areas, at least I have seen in the destination locations in Chennai and Bangalore to an extent, where there is a conscious conversation on where are people staying. So now it's become mandatory for many of the industries to have number of people per room, number of sanitization, etc. have become mandatory. So that's not only in the factory premises, but the other. So I think these are very small wins at this point, not on the scale that is required to make a change, but positive still.
They have some potential for future things happening better. And,
I think we need forums where we can publicize that.
Publicize this.
Because that needs magnifying.
Dr. Indradeep, what would you, look at? Were there any positive developments based on your studies or even incidental observations?
So I think I would echo of the observations already offered by the first two speakers. I would say that I think one of the things that this has done is that it has just sensitized and brought much more awareness to the problems of the informal sector. I mean, those of us who are working in this sector obviously already knew about these problems, even though even we were surprised in certain respects, but we already knew about these problems. And I think that there were many commonsensical things that we were surprised were not already happening, which I think now have begun to happen. So for example, the idea that a migrant worker should be able to access rations at the place of destination is just such a commonsensical thing to for states to action. Yet it took the COVID pandemic to basically push states to start offering that. So I think that there were many. So what the pandemic did was it was acted as a kind of tipping point for several commonsensical demands to be finally activated and action. And I think that the other thing is that, I think politically, as well as among corporates, CSR foundations, philanthropic foundations, civil society organizations, we all have become much more aware and ready, therefore, to think about these problems, to address these problems. And I think that especially on civil society organization, I think we have learned how important civil society organizations can be in partnering with public sector institutions to help the informal sector.
Oh, yeah, that's quite encouraging. I would turn to Dr. Pansalkar now. This is a different question in the sense we have seen now, based on what you also said earlier, in the metros, there are lots of things that went wrong. Meaning, in terms of a policy or a strategy, what exactly failed? Because we were otherwise having policies for dealing with crisis. We have got all kinds of task forces, and we have got all kinds of rapid action forces for a range of things. What exactly might have been a failure, and what is it that you think we should learn from this, so that in future we are better prepared if anything, God forbid, comes again?
Yeah. Very, very pithy question. What I would imagine, and what I strongly feel, because there is a kind of backing back to my experience and so on, because I interacted with some of the state officers and so on in the metro, at least Mumbai. See, the public officer has been generally in a strongly denial mode about the existence of people without homes, without as Gayatri would say, lonely and homeless in a strange city. He's in a denial mode. He doesn't believe they exist. I remember about, again, a decade back, a conversation with the Bombay Municipal Corporation commissioner, talking to him, and we were talking about street hawkers and people like that, again, very much in the informal sector. And what is the policy? What is the municipal corporation thinking about them, etc.? And the bland answer which I got is, they should not be there. I'm serious. They should not be there. That was the answer. The second thing which I would tell you, once I was in Raigada, which is a big source of migrant from Odisha, and the train which I was boarding, there were hordes and hordes of people wanting to board into unreserved compartment. Next time I went there, I talked about, again with some government officer, saying that, look, why are so many people migrating from your city, or from your district? Said, no, that's not really true. There must be pilgrims, That's the degree of denial which the public officers had. So I'm not at all surprised that this failed, because nobody was prepared for it. It's not very undoable to create large spaces where migrants could live together or something like this. It becomes very difficult because of two things. One, subcultural identity, that parochialism. Marathi Manus kind of a thing coming up in Mumbai, while Mumbai runs on the back of the labor people coming from UP and Bihar. So if you create spaces like this, maybe they'll be all cornered by, government doesn't want to get into politics, but issues of this might come, but they're not undoable, provided people were not in a denial mode. So that long years of denial is what has caused the major problem. That's what I would think.
Yeah. Dr. Srivastava, Mr. Pansalkar says, look, this inability to accept a problem which is very much right, it's an elephant in the room. You don't want to see the elephant at all and say, go all around that. Is there something more to the failure that we have seen, especially in the metros during this period?
Yeah, well, I would put it another way. Years of globalization, rapid urban growth tended to glamorize urban growth and urban areas. And to that extent, the reverse happened, which was a complete denial of the very large, dark underbelly of urbanization, which really consisted of this enormous, motley of people coming from everywhere, and contributing to this urban growth, industrial growth in and around cities. The second thing is really, call it failure or call it what we may, because we so seriously underestimated the role of mobility and labor mobility in all this. Therefore, government's efforts to docket, to identify people and to do things, but in some sense, which were all based on patterns of sedentary populations. That populations are sedentary either in urban areas or rural areas. And we fail to understand that populations move all the time to be part of economic activity. So one of the fundamental failures was not being able to really, when all this happened, there were these large masses of people which the government could not identify, could not reach out to do, where social protection systems failed altogether. But this was part of a continuing process of development, and it did not happen overnight.
Okay. So, the long-standing nature of the problem, the failure to recognize it in its true dimension, and also the fact that most of the population, a significant part, has always been mobile. Somehow they were making do. A pandemic like this made the evacuation almost immediate. Then you get into all kinds of issues that we have not been able to. And of course, the denial factor. I turn to another question now. This is, I think I will start with Dr. Pansalkar here. You see, in the rural areas, we had even originally quite a significant extent of people who were employed, so to say, but half employed, 1/4 employed. Sometimes the employment was not even paid for, meaning you can take grass from here for your cow or something, no more than that is possible. Things like that were happening. And now with migrants having gone back there, even though we have come to see very clearly it is a sharing, caring culture in the rural areas, still that exists. Whether it is poverty or plenty, they are willing to do that. How do we see the ability of the rural areas to absorb these people? Given the already low wage levels, already marginal kind of, except some pockets of affluence in agriculture. How do you see this playing out?
See, one should kind of rural. Rural is not a homogeneous thing.
Yeah.
So if one is talking about, let's say, rural Devariya or rural Madhubani, then the possibility of those guys absorbing this return labor who doesn't want to go back to the city, their ability will be very low, because the land land can be measured in literally square feet and not in acres. And the population of Devariya, for example, its population density might be as big as that of a small city. So in such densely populated area, nothing much can be done there. But I think the answer lies perhaps in and this has been said very often, so I'm not original, in kind of creating many more poles of kind of pasa industrial or service activity. And I think that digital technology permits that a great deal. So it doesn't really need to be produced in Mumbai or Thane or Pune or something. It can very well be produced somewhere in Agra or maybe in Chapra or some such thing. And the transportation networks are pretty good now. So the labor needs to go from Madhubani to Chapra, not from Madhubani to Mumbai. And that itself would reduce a great deal of this risk. This number one. Number two, I think the kind of demand profile of what people want in the villages, that itself has been changing. That itself has been changing. A couple of years back, we did this research trying to figure out what is the changes in the nature of markets, small town, Kasba level markets that has been happening. Now, 20 years back, 30 years back, if you had gone into a small place like Kesla, where Pradhan has his office, you probably would have found it tough to get a cup of tea. But today you could get 4 or 5 Chinese stalls there, So the demand profile is changing. Now, much of the migrant labor that's returning, he's trying to accommodate, and who don't want to go back to the city. He's trying to find livelihoods in occupations which are now demanded because of the changing demand profile of the local, the specific things they want. So that's where the answer probably would lie. I think I'll stop here.
Oh yeah, Indradeep, what's your take on this?
So I think, I would agree with what has been said. I think that we need to develop the rural economy. I think that I also think that it may be a little too early to call to render a verdict on whether people are ready to return or not. I think that it will take a little bit of time. I think that the natural dynamics of labor market adjustment will, I don't know when in the future, but soon, I hope in the future, will produce more migration back to the cities as jobs in the cities begin to reappear and as wage levels begin to rise again. I do think, however, that given that there has been so much migration back to homes for these migrant workers, there is a real opportunity to undertake policies and reforms that are able to provide employment opportunities, so that, because Indian cities are also not doing so well. They are becoming more and more unlivable, frankly. And much of that is because of the pressure of rural to urban migration. So I think that there is a real opportunity to do something to advance, maybe it's industrialization, I don't know, of rural India. But I also think that, labor market dynamics will soon cause migration to happen again in large numbers. I think we are still in the middle of the adjustment process.
I'll turn to Dr. Gayatri now. You see, I'll also try and push you from this to even a question towards the next. Given that these people who have gone there, they do not want to come back. And like Dr. Ghosh said, it's not something final. Given time, some more might want to return, and some might say, okay, I had enough of being there in the city or a town. Is it going to put some pressure on the industries? Meaning now whether the industries might want to migrate, the way Dr. Pansalkar was saying, you might now feel like, okay, I can take it to a place nearer where they are, so that they have half mobility problem, I have the remainder of the half mobility problem. We can. The second is, the kind of people who have gone from the cities back to the rural area, they have now picked up things like, okay, how do you actually, what kind of markets are there? How do you price a product? What an urban market looks for in terms of demand? How some services are, actually delivered? Sometimes it might be a surprise for them that certain things have to be paid for. Like somebody selling this cold water in, say, Bombay, somewhere in Marine Drive, he has to be paid so much per glass of water, which might have been so unusual when he was in the rural area. Meaning, they pick up certain things about how you monetize, how you market. Are these going to be useful if they have to be absorbed in the rural area? Are there things that, because I think the farm sector income, we now know that it's hardly about 45% for some of the higher order houses, and it is lower than 60% even for those at the lowest category of what you call farm households. The remaining comes from a range of other activities and services. So taking that into account, do you think these are things that might happen? And do they call for any effort at skilling these people?
So I think the first and foremost is there's a very large number of rural households which are unviable. So almost, I think, 2 lakhs or 2.5 lakhs of villages are economically unviable units. I think that's a first problem that we have. The second, I think, why people haven't come, maybe quite very basic. And I can tell you because we've been running buses to bring people back to work. The trains have not started functioning at full speed. So we still have people waiting to buy tickets, Tatkal tickets not available. So that is a big problem. Of course, I'm going to restrict my comment to the states I know there is a problem, which is Jharkhand, Odisha and West Bengal, but Bihar. So to Bangalore, Delhi, Chennai, still there are very, very few trains. So mobility has been actually, in a sense, poor have lost mobility. I think mobility, in a sense, brought them economic prosperity at home because they were able to earn money and take the money back home. They lived in terrible conditions in the city, but it gave them an economic way. Whether they can use the skill sets in the rural area, I think a small percentage of them may be able to use, but not all. The larger, with the industry will move so fast, I think requires a lot of thought. Because it's not only about the industry, but it is about all the ancillaries. What is the transportation cost? What is the viability of producing it there? Even a 100-kilometer shift has serious implications. Now, for example, I think Delhi NCR has for a long time trying to see whether industries can move out. So if you look at garment, can it move from Delhi NCR to Karnal Panipat? And not only the Karnal Panipat belt, but slightly interior, I'd say it's been tough. And I'm not even talking of I'm talking of fairly simple ones. So suppose one got away from simple garments to say you wanted to do jeans manufacturing. So can you do the color wash there? Simple things. It may sound simple. Plus, where is the infrastructure for it? So do we have industrial sheds for it? Do we have the power required for it? I think there are a number of questions which are there. So we need to marry state policy to, just to borrow from Professor Sanjeev, to ensure that Chhapra works. If it has to work, all this has to work. It can't be where we just tell industry come and set up, but we have to have the enabling framework for it. And I think that's what's missing. So every department is working in silos, not together to make it happen. So probably everybody has the target, but nobody has the target.
Nobody. Okay, Dr. Srivastava, what's your take on this?
So yes, I mean, when migrants have gone back, but a large percentage have already, in my view, remigrated simply because there were no jobs to be had at home. There are still, some proportion of migrants who have not gone back, and because although they have been in touch with their destination areas, there is still a lack of jobs. Jobs are not growing rapidly enough in urban areas, and they're still waiting for an opportunity. There is a small percentage again who would like to stay back and who have tried to use their skills, capitals, resources in order to see how they can make their ends meet in the rural areas. That is also happening. It's true that when large number of these migrants went back, they went back with different skill sets, with very different skill sets and so on, which could have been utilized in the rural areas. But that requires policies, that requires public investment, that requires the right kind of environment to be built up. And although some states did try to do that, Odisha is an example which was slightly more proactive than other states in trying to provide a policy, an environment to keep migrants and to provide them with jobs. But most states really, it was more verbiage than actual policy. And therefore, there was no real support to migrants, other than even Manrega was not really for migrants, for everyone who was short of a rural unskilled job. That's one. Now, industry, it's true today that economies of scale at the firm level have become much less important now than they were earlier. But agglomeration economies, and which is what indirectly Gayatri referred to, are very important. And they're still providing the main the reason for these large urban growth centers which continue to evolve, although there are largest numbers of these urban growth centers now today than there were earlier. And if one needs to counteract them, then once again one really needs to go back to traditional economic theory and aim at what have been called in development literature counterpoles, and which is what we aimed at somewhat before the era of completely liberal economic policy or neoliberal economic policy. So I think that can be developed, but you need to have supporting economic policies and right down from macro policy to meso level policies in order to make that work. It cannot happen in isolation. These are not decisions which migrants alone can make.
Rajiv, I turn to you now. I also want you to add some flavor to what has been discussed. With Dr. Gayatri saying, look, there are so many villages. As an economic unit, they are unviable, very small, poorly endowed natural resources, and not enough of a demand to make things work. So returning migrant, net, maybe he doesn't have, just because of the skill sets alone, to make things different. And also there are issues. And if they have to really be stabilized there, like Dr. Srivastava said, you have to have a host of things, from a policy, then an enabling environment. And Dr. Gayatri said, you have to also have the transport, logistics, and the entire ecosystem that will make these industries work. From your point of view, how you look at this? Secondly, you have been sitting on some of the heaviest out-migrating spaces, like Dungarpur. And how did you see, if you could give a comparison of what was your, thought process of this just before the reverse migration took place, if you have an idea of that, and after they came back, what happened to the local area? If you have a flavor of that, that might be interesting.
No, thank you for this. Very interesting indeed. And, I must say that from our region, from South Rajasthan, which is an Adivasi, very heavy out-migration area to Gujarat and Maharashtra, the return to Gujarat and Maharashtra is nearly complete now. People are almost entirely back. Even if they are living without work every day and working at wages that are lesser than what they were receiving earlier, people are definitely back. And that is because it's just not enough to do back here, right? And the period that they spent here was really hand to mouth. It was very, very frugally spent because there was no work, and they were basically living off large amounts of accumulated debt. That was basically financing their consumption in the villages. So there's no other way. In fact, if anything, more people have returned because schools have been shut down, and therefore young people have also entered. School-going children have entered the labor construction market in Ahmedabad, Surat, and Rajkot, and so on. So that's what we see. To my mind, there is, I think, definitely need to revisit the potential in the rural economy, in the agriculture and the agrarian economy. And we must do that. Of course, it is so pitted with adversity that even as I make the recommendation, even as I wrote the recommendation with Professor Phansalkar in our chapter, I kept thinking, how will this major reversal happen in the agriculture-related fortunes for small and marginal farmers who become part of the large informal workforce? This is not going to be easy at all, right? And therefore, while the more structural kind of changes take place in the way public policy operates vis-a-vis the farm sector, I think at least 2 or 3 things need to be attended to. One is around rural wages. And I first would certainly call upon Manrega to be far stronger and far more resourced, far more efficient than it currently is. Manrega has the potential of providing some kind of floor, protection to rural households, and I think just that performance will be huge around Manrega. Similarly, the whole framework, the whole kind of portal of social security and entitlement, which have to do around PDS, around healthcare, around nutrition, which form the foundation of poor households' survival, which will prevent them from making distressed migration choices. We need to improve those basic essential services in rural areas, even while the broader economic questions on agriculture are being sorted out. Right? I also have understood the importance of doing a congruent urban employment guarantee, at the urban end, ensuring that there is some wage compensation, wage insurance, and looking at the potential of activating urban employment as a matter of right to workers who are in urban areas. And there's already some good thinking around those kinds of aspects. So these are some of the more immediate kind of public policy spaces that need to be activated, even while we look at the longer term reversal of the rural fortunes, that in a place like Udaipur, Dungarpur, Banswara is not going to be very soon immediate or easy. It ought to be done, but we cannot let large amounts of distress be replayed all over again as we enter the post-COVID kind of space.
I think now I got a few questions out here from the audience. There is one on where is the balance between acknowledging subsistence economies at villages as being okay versus excessive focus on surplus economies where products and money must be circulated. Maybe they are referring to the urban and metro areas. So where is the balance? Dr. Srivastava, would you like to just take this up?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there is no dichotomy in the sense that the rural economies are not only subsistence economies, they're also economies which are very much part of the exchange, surplus and accumulation economy. So that's not really the balance. The lack of balance arises in the fact that really the rural economies in general, I mean, basically what I would like to call, it's basically the question of unequal development. And the question of unequal development at one level is a rural versus urban issue. At another level, it's also a regional issue. Bihar versus Maharashtra and so on and so forth. So there are certain areas which, for various reasons, and I'm not going to go into them, but it's also policy driven, which have been growing much faster, where employment has been growing much faster, which then tend to act as magnets for labor. And what we need to reconcile is the policy. But do we want to encourage or talk about policies which feed on wider gaps between regions and rural urban areas, or do we want to look at creating a policy supportive environment which creates jobs for people where they live? I think that is extremely important. And in the long run, I think we are moving towards looking at economies and societies in terms of, for various reasons, for environmental reasons, for economic reasons, and so on, for looking at creating more and more jobs for people in more dispersed areas and around the areas where they live, rather than trying to create very large growth centers where they can come and work. So I think that, in my view, we need to look at a broader policy matrix which can encourage that.
Wow. Dr. Pansalkar, I think I will come to you with this next question. This talks about what would be critical to, meaning recommendation that will be critical to ensure minimum social protection of informal workers. This is the question. But I will also add up the other thing that we had in mind. We had these changes to the labor code, and we have got this fresh set of regulations that have been brought in. How do you see this playing out compared to what was there earlier? This new one, is it likely to improve the conditions on the ground and afford higher protection to informal sector workers? I think I will go on this question with all of you. You can start off.
Let's come to what is required for protecting or looking after the informal sector workers. And if one assumes that a large number of them will still be in the urban areas and so on. So I think what I would recommend strongly is, it's born out of the recognition that after all, we have to survive surplus labor, and therefore economic theories will predict that the wage rates will go down and down and down because the population is so high and labor availability is so high. So the question is not to make economic activity run viable by increasing wages artificially, but trying to provide social protection. Now that social protection needs to be, of course, that will be at public cost and so on, but maybe the citizen involvement also is of importance. That's very minor example I might give is, why can't gated communities which are abounding now in metropolitan cities, why can't they look after the domestic workers who are coming in to them for working in the various households? Why can't it be mandated that gated communities must have, for instance, a creche, for instance, a restroom for women? Why can't it be done? It should be done. No, these kinds of wider set of policies See, COVID, of course, is occupying all our mind space, but beyond COVID also, informal sector workers will continue to be in the cities and they'll need to be looked after. So similar thing, the transportation hubs, all the loading, unloading, what they call the Mathadi workers, the measures for looking after them need to be created in transportation hubs, where truck loading, unloading centers are there, etc. So wherever a particular group of user industry is concentrated, there one must have a mandated policy for looking after basic well-being, which means essentially places for them to sleep and places where they could cook their food and things like toilet and things like that. That has to be created as a matter of mandated policy. This is what I would say. So far as the labor code is concerned, my view is that you may create whatever kind of codes you will create. So long as the economic theory dictating fall of wages, people will get around it. There will be informalization, there will be contractization, there will be myriad ways in which people will defy the labor code. So I'm not very optimistic on that point at all. I'll stop here.
So there is a distinct threat of more informalization taking place if the codes are implemented in a tough manner. So what do you say, Dr. Gayatri? How do you respond to this totality of the question? Social protection measures and the implications of the labor code?
I think one very important thing that has to happen is it's come in the form of this whole gig work and task. But the informal sector has always been paid on a task based. And it has never been recognized. All the wages are always calculated on a not on a task based, but on an hourly, daily wage basis. And I think that is the disconnect which often happens. While I'm sort of torn between saying it's a good thing and a bad thing, but sometimes I feel at least if you have cancer, you'll address it. Not recognizing it is not an answer. Therefore, assuming we are able to actually call out what is wage for a task and work it out, I think it will be good for a lot of people. Having said that, the moment it becomes task-based, it's not hands-off for all social protection. So if we can distinguish the two, today social protection is available to so few. If you look at PF, ESI as two main social protection, it's available to so few. PDS for workers in any work site is not available at all. So in that case, I think widening social protection and focusing more on widening social protection and transforming the way in which a task-based wage can be defined, I think will be important. Linking the two, I think, has really caused harm rather than good.
Yep, Dr. Indradeep Bush, so how do you look at this issue of social protection, how you actually protect the interests of, meaning earlier I think Raju talked about an urban equivalent of the employment guarantee scheme. We have got other variants of universal basic income, which is now to some extent accepted in the farm sector. Would you look at some of these and also the disturbances that can happen in the labor market because of the codes?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of how to reconstitute India's social protection is such a vast question, because even before you ask that question, I mean, the first question that arises when you ask that question is it's a public finance question. Does the government have funds to even, widen social protection? Gayatri just mentioned ESI. ESI is underperform. I mean, it's really an underperforming scheme. Even though it has the potential, it has the genuine potential of becoming an exemplary scheme of health insurance, of social health insurance, because on paper, if you look at ESI on paper, it's perfect. But when you look at the implementation and the execution of ESI, you see that basically the scheme is sitting on crores and crores of rupees, basically. You know, if this were a scheme in the US, they would have to return the premiums back to the beneficiaries. So I would say that, you know, taking up the question of the labor codes, you know, I think first of all, we must consider what a minimum wage is supposed to do. So, I mean, I'm really going to take up this question from first principles, you know, and if you look at the history, for instance, Article 23 of the Indian Constitution says that there is a fundamental right against forced labor and directs the state to promote a decent standard of work. And then 1948, there's the Minimum Wages Act, Fair Wages Committee, etc. 1957, you have the 15th Indian Labour Conference. And then in 1982, the Supreme Court says that paying workers less than the minimum wage amounts to forced labor. So the implication of this is, and this was also pointed out by the Second National Labour Reforms Commission in 2002, that the minimum wage need any correlation to the type of work being performed. It is to be computed only on the basic needs of workers in each region. And in fact, the Parliamentary Standing Committee also recommended, you know, for the wages code, they are recommended that a right to sustenance be made part of this code. But however, the wages code does not make any reference to consumption at all. Instead, it doesn't ground the idea of a minimum wage in consumption needs.
No CPI, no WPI.
Yeah, the wages code, what it provides is basically it says that the minimum wage is to be fixed with reference to the skill of the workers required for working under the categories of unskilled, skilled, semi-skilled, and highly skilled, or geographical area, or both, and may also consider the arduousness of work performed. It provides no guidelines to account for minimum consumption by households, despite the Supreme Court statements. And so basically, my conclusion is that workers could be left no better off than they are today.
Okay. Rajiv, I turn to you now. There is another question also which has come here. It probably connects up with something you have said earlier. But what's your feedback on government's response to the migration? In the short term, they increased this NREGS allocations for rural employment, so returning migrants can get more, and affordable rental housing in the urban areas. They also came up with this concept of financing street vendors under this Swanidhi scheme. There are different ways in which different banks are going about. Do you see all these as appropriate kind of responses? And is there something more that the government can do?
So, you know, I think there has to be some agreement around the core kind of principle around social protection, and that has to be around universalization, around universal access. What a lot of social protection suffers from are very, very arduous kind of entry barriers that are based on domicile. Okay, which means that workers from Odisha and Bihar and Maharashtra will have no entitlements. They will not be entitled to PDS or to public housing or to healthcare. And unless those kinds of restrictions are done away with, unless there is inherent portability in what workers are entitled to, we will fail them yet again, despite all the announcements around affordable housing, around PDS, around healthcare and so on. And I think that universalization of access has to come into play as far as the large amount of informal workforce, which is mobile in nature. If that is the reality of our urban economy, then it has to accept that. And unless that is sorted out, it will not be addressed. Secondly, the pandemic, we knew this again earlier, and again the lockdown reminded us that wages have to be considered as public good. Okay, we no longer can see it as just a determinant of the market. It has to be protected as a public good, which means that there has to be assurance of wage, and the denial of wages, wage frauds, wage irregularities have to be addressed singularly through a system of justice, response, and legal aid that has to become part of the social protection framework. Currently legal aid for informal workers is is very, very marginal, especially given that they have no access to police or labor courts, and the system itself doesn't exist sufficiently for them to turn to. And I think wages, protection of wages, including minimum wages and what workers ought to earn from their contractors and from their employers, has to come into force. And part of the social protection framework has to become access to justice in very large scale cases of wage frauds and wage denials. We have to absolutely ensure that happens. Finally, on the policy, on the government response front, I think there's a lot of tokenism right now, Srinivasan. There's a lot of schemes that are speaking to the idea of responding to the migrants, but the devil is in the detail. And I think that's where we are creating enormous amounts of problems. For example, in so many new entitlements, the Aadhaar-based kind of entitlement creates huge entry barriers. We have so many cases of rejections because now the Aadhaar database does not speak to other databases. When creating those kinds of conditions will actually not will just make sure that we buy the time and buy just time new problems and new situations. But I strongly feel that an alternative system of justice delivery and of wage protection has to be used for informal workers to bounce back.
Thanks, Rajiv. I will take off from where you concluded. I think I will first address this question to Professor Srivastava. We have responded to this pandemic in several ways for doing several things: increase job availability in rural areas, increase entitlement in public distribution, then trying to give some loans, expand liquidity that is available in the market so that, and also lots of borrowers from the system, especially the bottom of the pyramid people, their loans can be put under moratorium and all that. In the middle of all this, we have also brought in quite some extent of digitized delivery of services, whether it is PDS, whether it is cash transfers, things like that. And even I think whether you are having COVID or not, you have to download an app and then you have to put your name and all that. Then only whether this digitization has become a barrier for several people, either in accessing services or in benefits, whether it could have been done with more sensitivity.
Well, I think digitization, in my sense, I mean, frankly, this juggernaut of digitization that we are seeing, and also this Aadhaar-based identity or other forms of identity established, without actually establishing a framework in which data privacy can, number one, can be sensibly invoked for the last sections of our population, data privacy, data security, and so on and so forth. And secondly, the understanding that digitization itself is being built on a digital divide itself. So let me give you a simple example of we've of course promoted digitization, and people have to go to they use their debit cards or whatever cards had to access money. How do people in the slums and villages do it? They simply hand over their debit cards to somebody else, tell them their password, tell them the amount they need, and there's a whole informal network of middlemen and intermediary network which has developed, which allows them to access the digital means. So we forget that we're living on this ocean of illiteracy, low literacy. There is a digital divide, and we are promoting something which people themselves cannot make use of. Okay, so I think so we have to. I mean, we have nothing against digitization, but we do have to understand the context in which digitization is being promoted. Unique, identity or biometric identification methods of identification are being promoted, and we also have to understand the pitfalls of all of this in certain contexts. But I just want to say something. If you can give me a minute on what.
Please go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
I just wanted to say that, when you talk about labor and when we're talking about social protection, we really need to connect the dots. And you can't speak about labor without talking about capital. No, talking about capital.
The capital part.
And to understand that over a period of time in India, inequality has been systematically increasing within the labor market and between labor and capital. And that capital in India thrives on indecent work, low wages, and informalization. And if you want to look at an alternative model of development, then we must look at universal social protection, rights-based social protection, decent work. This is the only way you can correct the overall inequality in development and put India on a high productivity, self-sustained path of development, not a low road to development. So we need to think just beyond labor and think of labor and capital
together. I think Dr. Gayatri, would you like to examine the question of digitalization? What is happening in the informal sector? People, their access.
Would entirely agree. And if you add gender onto it, it becomes even worse.
Even worse.
Like for example, I can tell you, we run training classes and everybody said go digital, and we did. We find that the pecking order, even for a mobile phone usage, is men, children, and women in that order. So, simply accessing itself is a problem. So I think it's an over-romanticized feeling that everybody will have. It's very good. I'm not saying it isn't, but I think we need to put more to ensure that digitization can happen. Access, and access. I think that needs to really, that everybody doesn't have the same access has to be something we understand.
Yeah. Dr. Ghosh, I think you have written in your paper about the different layers of exclusion when it comes to the migrants accessing benefits even before. I think one of the most critical ones are the digital divide, like what Dr. Srivastav said. And of course, on the digital divide, Dr. Gayatri has added the gender divide as well. In your report, I think there's quite a bit of this you have described. Would you like to say what it will take to cure this, if at all there is a cure in the short run?
So I think we have, we have identified, we have thought hard about this problem, about digital financial inclusion, about data privacy, etc. And we have looked at, there are as I said, there are 4 layers of exclusion, and for DBT, for Manrega, for PPDS, etc. And we found that for DBT, the most prominent source of exclusion is back-end processing of the amount. So there's a very high incidence of failure of crediting beneficiary accounts with the cash transfer. Okay, and so in fact, Tamil Nadu State Welfare Board transfers registered probably one of the highest number of exclusions of this type. So I think that certainly at the enrollment stage and at the back-end processing stage, which are mostly now digitized, tremendous we need to properly understand why these systems are not working. And we need to, somebody said that there is, the Aadhaar being used as an identification system, the NPCI the tracker not connecting Aadhaar numbers with bank accounts properly. These are problems that I think everybody knows these are problems. The issue is why aren't we seeing action on these problems? And so I think that the whole digital question is again a very big question. But if you just look at how DBT has performed, and because the direct benefits transfer system, one of the key so-called advantages of the DBT system now is that it is digitized, but we find still that there is a lot of exclusion happening at the enrollment and back-end processing stages, and not necessarily at the cash out stage.
Very true, meaning in the sense, 3 years back, also the AEPS payment failure, they were around 35-36%. Because biometric.
Yeah, even in the early months
during
of
COVID
the
times, even during COVID, it has actually increased in some locations to more than 60%. Now, if a person goes out there, say 1 out of every 3 person doesn't get paid, especially in a situation like this, what would be the confidence in the kind of new systems that we bring in? It looks like a classic divide between the Bharat and the India concept. In terms of, there are people who say this works beautifully from my mobile, I can do everything. There is a chap says, what does a mobile look like where I can tap something? My mobile has a very small screen, or like Gayatri said, look, my mobile is 2 levels up. First, I have to convince my child to get out of the queue, then tell the husband, can you spare it for 2 minutes? And if that is the route to accessing cash, women lose the cash in many situations. Anyhow, I think this is a problem where financial sector, the government and the constituents, there should be some kind of an agreement which will put things in a better frame. I think we will now try and wind this up. Before that, I will just read out some of the questions which have come, which actually lead us to our last question. After 1 year of pandemic, we have enough systems in place to tackle a similar situation in future, in which we can avoid the tragedies that we have been visited with? Then it also talks about are the current level of physical labor, digital infrastructure adequate to meaningfully manage and build a better living setup for informal workers? What should be prioritized in that? There is a more, activist question. In a state which is inclined towards protecting capitalist interests, what is the scope of legislation, union and local administration to protect labor interests? And also, I think there is a question which leads us to our last question. What are your top 2 recommendations to the government that will be critical for ensuring minimum protection to informal workers? Maybe we all can take about a minute or so to reflect on what would be our top 2 policy changes, which will make the informal sector better off, which will improve the livelihoods out there, which offer a better and more reliable social and welfare nets. So who wants to start? I think Dr. Pansalkar had to drop out because he had somewhere to go, I think. Rajiv, can I start with you?
So I would repeat what I said earlier.
Okay.
I think we have a serious issue with wages. We have a very significant part of the informal workforce which does not earn a minimum wage. We do not have systems in place that regulates payments of wages in time. And it used to happen earlier, but it is happening even more today, that daily waged labor systems are moving to piece rated systems, okay, in which there is a continuing process of cheapening of labor, in which labor is cheapened, okay. And I think we need to really focus on the way wages are determined, ensured, and paid to workers in the large kind of economic environment. And now that is it's a major structural kind of a issue. Technology should support it. It should be able to support it. But I think legislation and has to kick in to ensure that wages are not compromised in whatever be the employment relation. Whether it is contractual, whether it is piece rated, whether it is full, fixed term employment, which by the way has been legitimized in the new labor code without any ceiling, and that actually creates even more flexibility in the labor market. These are ways in which labor will be cheapened. It will not become productive. It will not be part of the kind of growth story that we are talking about. So I really would like to focus on wages. The other recommendation that I often make, and that is very much draws upon what Professor Srivastav has written extensively about is around universal access, especially in cities, in urban areas. And that is of core services, of core entitlements, which is around PDS, healthcare, nutrition, and and we stand a lot for, legal access of, ensuring that workers are able to claim their money back, which the morality of our economy will make sure that they keep bleeding out of money. So I think those two areas I would strongly recommend as areas of action.
Thanks, Rajiv. Dr. Gayatri?
I was just trying to put down a few points. I think to me the larger issue is the implementation of all of these. Loose interpretation of various laws often causes more problems. So I think one should be very careful with the way in which the labor laws are being defined. Oftentimes, they may actually cause a regressive behavior. So, and that's why I more and more feel that the importance of defining task-based is important. The way in which we've defined labor as labor laws and wages have really no relevance to the way in which the market is going. And that is worrying. So I think that's the first that needs to be fixed. And parallelly, I do believe that, we need to have a much more aggressive stand on social protection. We can't afford to just wait for chance. While we do have a financing problem there, today's answer is also not a question, not the way to go forward. So better integration by better acknowledgement of labor practices and then building from there for improvement is very important. So I think today's labor laws are neither benefiting the worker nor the employer, and if the employer is there, who is the employer is a big question today.
Okay. Dr. Ghosh?
Yeah, so I would echo something that Rajiv said. Fix exclusion in Manrega, PDS, and other statute-based welfare programs. Give us an example of something that actually works. I mean, give the citizens an example of something that works. And the other thing I would say, since it did come up, we didn't talk about it much, but it is actually, I think, on my and on Dwara's also, radar, is Fix ESI. Fix, the ESI is on paper a beautiful scheme. In practice a disaster. The ESI board has something like 60 members. How are you going to do anything with a 60-member board? So I think Fix ESI, and on the other side, fix exclusion in Manrega, PDS, and other statute-based welfare programs.
Thank you. Dr. Srivastava.
So two separate things.
Yeah.
One is, of course, building up on what everybody has said about social protection, universal access to social protection. Here, I would just like to add two other ingredients. One is that this has to be built on a statutory footing. Indradeep said, well, it doesn't seem to, the statutory improve access or doesn't, or does it not? That is an open question, and that is a question which we can even ask with respect to political rights that we have. Just the fact that you have political rights in our constitution doesn't mean that they work for all of us. But that increases the level of accountability in the system. So I would say, and in the NCUS, this is what we put forward, a statutory universal system of social protection. And that can have many ingredients. I also feel that I don't feel that financing it at a particular level is really an issue at our stage of development. And this is something we should be seriously looking at in policy. The other issue, which perhaps is something where which underlies this whole notion of decent work, but which requires an unbundling of informal workers into those who are self-employed, and those who are wage employed, and then also conceding that there are enormous amounts of heterogeneity between and among each of these groups, coming with a set of policies where one can increase their productivity and incomes. And if you look at it over a period of time, for example, if you look at self-employed workers, their access to credit has been declining. Micro enterprises share in total credit has been declining. Their access to markets has been declining thanks to demonetization, GST, and then now, of course, the latest crises and so on and so forth. What can we do to reverse it? What can we do to increase their productivity? What can we do to increase their incomes? And then as far as wages is concerned, I would go along with a lot of recommendations which Rajiv has made. And I would also like to point out that, yes, and again, Dilip has said with respect to the wage code, and I would like to point out that the labor codes really, which were meant more for the organized sector than for the unorganized sector, but the organized sector has this share of informal workers, actually really create the grounds for greater precarity, and the code on social security doesn't provide us with a framework for the kind of statutory extension that we want for unorganized sector social security.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava. I think it had been a fascinating, round of discussions. I personally feel quite, informed on a few things with all your help. And so in conclusion, I would only say this. The pandemic brought the fault lines out much more clearly, though some of us might already been having ideas that this is a larger problem which can go haywire. But the pandemic brought it out in manners that many people didn't realize. But the good thing is government has become acutely aware of what they are sitting on, with so many people flitting from one corner of the country to another in search of a livelihood. And then, of course, they did bring about certain programs and schemes to try and address the problem, whether it is enhancing the job quotas or whether it is putting more of credit into certain types of small enterprises, or even improving healthcare in whatever ways that they have tried to do. So this is a recognition of there being a problem. But the point that Dr. Pansalkar made earlier, this has come after having to surpass the high levels of denial originally in the system. When you finally end up looking to the cremation grounds where people are not willing to, either bury or whatever, when you find things lined up and hospitals overflowing, denial doesn't seem to work anymore. Then there were a lot more things. So in future, can we take this as a starting point? If there is a problem that is underlying, I will recognize the problem, become aware, and then build a framework for overcoming that rather than denying it in the first phase. That becomes one of the issues. And I think overall, when you look at the issue is one of inclusion, which we talk about in larger sense in inclusive growth and inclusive policy and inclusive finance and all that. Here, I think there is a total failure of inclusion to a large extent. Like all of you have pointed out, at a personal level, individuals did not feel it necessary to take care of whom they employed. Maybe in groups and gated communities, the responses were different. As a society also, we were apathetic to a large extent for some time. Later on, lots of other human instinct kicked in, but it took some time. We took it, okay, it's fine. These people can always walk back home and we do not know. But then the realization that there is a human element involved, we cannot give them a subhuman treatment, that kicked in. But then, are we still looking at inclusion as a larger theme when we look at all these people who are around us, whether the maid, the driver, the casual worker, the Swiggy delivery man? What are those issues? Because eventually, any changes to a larger system also will require support, a democratic support from the civic society, people. So that I think one of the issues that comes up there. And I think also the employer's responsibility that comes very clearly to the fore, which is one of the issues we have talked about. When people come and work, do they also look at, I find out where this person is living, is it decent enough, and what are the conditions in which gets employed? And for example, a gated community, can it say, I will provide some night shelter for X number of people who are migrants who are coming and working in this complex, without feeling threatened, okay, this is highly risky, whether we can do that. Meaning things like this, is it possible, or setting up a creche, like someone said. So overall, are we looking at including people, whether migrants or otherwise, because they are actually making our lives better in the process of trying to make a livelihood for themselves. So what is the duty of a citizen, a civil society organization, or a corporate, and of course of the government? And the suggestions that have come, I am requesting access to put them together and then see whether there is a basis for taking it up for a further discussion with the government at whatever level that is feasible. And I would very much like access to keep in touch with the panel members and a few others to keep this discussion going, because we are at the start of the problem. So are there things that groups like this can actually contribute in terms of ideas from their own experiences? Maybe let us see whether next year when we come back, hopefully most of the panel will be back for a discussion on where we are compared to where we were, which is now. So that might be a good thing to discuss. I thank all of you for your wholehearted participation and for putting up with this problem of making it conversational, because normally sessions we are accustomed to having a 10-15 minute break free kind of what I have to say, and then audience doesn't get a way in. But you have been so cooperative, and it made probably everybody's the ability to listen much more. They heard a different person each 3-4 minutes and a wide variety of perspectives. And thank you for all the rich sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for such an insightful discussion with forward-looking recommendations. I'm sure our delegates, our viewers would have really benefited from this discussion. And special thanks to Mr. Srinivasan for such expert moderation. And with this, we come to an end of the sessions for today. And I would like to thank all delegates as well for being patient and logging in every day for 2 days. We also look back to receiving the feedback from our delegates and our speakers. Thank you so much, everyone.